My name is Mario Maliki. I was born in Croatia and I'm a postdoc currently at Metrics at Stanford, researching mostly research integrity and peer review. The last sort of year and a half, I've been focusing mostly on preprints. I was born in Croatia. I'm a medical doctor by training, but I went into research, did my PhD in integrity of scientific publications, and continued mostly in working on authorship issues, peer review issues, and publication bias and similar things. I've been an editor-in-chief of the only journal today in the world that focuses on research integrity and peer review. It is a Springer Nature journal, part of BMC, Biomed Central, and I've been an editor of that journal since 2019, since March of 2019. And since 2020, I've been a postdoc at Metrics. You can see here a little bit about my publications and interests. I list them here only because when we talk about peer review, it is often debatable what an expert is and how we judge other people's work. I would also like to start with something that is more common in humanities, and that's sort of where I stand on things today. I currently strongly believe that we should all be publishing both preprints and protocols that lists what are we going to do and how we're going to analyze them. I strongly advocate that researchers use reporting guidelines where they report their studies, that you share your data and code with other researchers so that we can accelerate science at a faster rate. And what I've been working on in the last year and what I will hopefully pilot next year is describing changes, what happened because of peer review in scientific publications. When it comes to my own sort of conflict of interests, I have been lucky to work for Cochrane Croatia while I was a medical, sort of a research fellow there. I worked with big publishers, so I know their benefits and their downsides. I'm a part of the PERI group, which is a consortium in Europe that looks at changes and innovations in peer review. I recently joined the European Association of Science Editors as a member of the peer review committee. And as I mentioned before, I'm an editor of this journal. Now, this project today started actually before the pandemic. We were interested in preprints much before all of them exploded during this pandemic. And here are listed the collaborators that I shared the idea of what I wanted to do. Now, I want to clearly state that these are still preliminary results. We're right in the process of finalizing our analysis and writing the manuscript. So currently all this presentation and all the opinions are just my own and not theirs. So if I say something that opposes maybe something that you've heard some of them say, don't be surprised about that. So this project, before we started it, we looked at all the studies that in the past have analyzed changes between either submitted manuscripts to journals and then published versions, or between preprints and published versions. And up to December 2020, there were 21 of those studies that we could find out. We didn't include the studies that only looked at changes in readability scores or abstract, because a systematic review on those two things has been published in 1992 for biomedical journals. We were more interested in the whole content changes of the manuscripts. Now, of those 21 studies, 16 looked at submitted versus published papers, and 5 looked at changes between preprints and published papers. Most of them looked at health sciences. So it's very rare that this kind of research is done in humanities or in social sciences. And I have to apologize because my study as well is dealing with epidemiology, so it is health sciences as well. Medium number of manuscripts and changes that these studies have looked at have been 62. Largest one being an analysis of archive and bioarchive preprints, which were sort of indexes with done between two versions to look at the word counts and the similarity text between the two. Most of these studies would develop a questionnaire, and then reviewers would fill out the questionnaire for one and for the other study. So sorry, for the submitted and for the posted and published version. And these would often be sort of based on reporting guidelines for specific study types. So they would have questions, you know, do you think that the methods were properly described, or were limitations properly listed, and things like that. And the problem with those often is who gets to judge if that something was properly done. And so when we looked at all of these 21, we weren't able to, because everyone used a different type of questionnaire and different questions that they asked, we decided that none of them were really of the kind of questions that we were interested in. And additionally, most of them always looked at specific types of studies within one single journal, and not even all the studies that are published in that journal. So often the generalizability of these studies was, in my opinion, quite low. So we couldn't really say what they have found. Overall, however, these studies did say that most changes that happen between versions of documents happen in background and in the discussion sections of papers. In only 2 studies did they look a little bit more details on what happened to analyses or conclusions, and approximately up to 30% of those had some changes. Again, they were based on only 2 studies on very specific journals, so we don't know how this relates to much more. Now, I listed here that the publication bias is potentially extremely high, because we have today more than 45,000 different journals out there, scholarly journals. Since beginning of, you know, sort of time, and since the first journals emerged, I think there's an estimate that there's been more than 90,000 scholarly journals ever that existed. So it's quite possible that editors or publishers have looked at changes that happened between submitted and published versions, but these internal reports are never published outside, so we don't know really what happens, where do the reviewers most often comment on things, and what do the authors don't know that the reviewers do know or that they need to change. So the purpose of our study has been to identify the changes in epidemiology preprints that were posted on bioRxiv, and then the versions that were later published in journals. Now, till the end of 2019, there were 1,500 epidemiology preprints. Now, bear in mind, bioRxiv was primarily life sciences preprint server, but it did include for a while epidemiology and even randomized controlled trials. These have now been moved to medRxiv. On the 5th of January this year, of those 1,538 preprints, 844 were published in a journal. Of those, 622 had only one preprint version. And recently, there's been an analysis of all 60 to 80,000 preprints posted on bioRxiv, and the numbers seem to be the same. Around 25 to 27% of all preprints have more than one version. So for this study, we'd only looked at those that had one version, and then the version that was published in the journal. We used the sample size calculation to determine how many we needed, and that was 121. We randomized of those 602 to pick these 121 that we will analyze. I will discuss all the details that we analyzed as I go through the slides. And most of the statistics that I'm going to be talking about today is really just descriptors, how many of those 121 had some things. How did we compare them? Most of the comparison, instead of a word count, was actually manual when we used the Microsoft Words compared to versions of a document. And then that sort of visually shows you when a sentence has been deleted, or when a word has been deleted, or when something has been added. And this is sort of one example of how was that. And then I described what actually occurred there. So just to sort of stress it one more time, there have been 121 preprints that we analyzed in this study. They have been published in 73 different journals. Most of those, the biggest number was actually published in PLOS journals, +1 having 20 of those preprints being published in it. The median impact factor of the preprints, of the journals where the preprints were published, was 4. And if we compare that sort of to Journal Citation Reports' closest category to epidemiology, which is public, environmental, and occupational health, which has 193 journals, we would see that the median impact factor of journals of these preprints is higher than the median of that category, potentially meaning that these preprints are maybe of a little bit higher quality than the average paper, at least when it comes to citations in epidemiology. Now, when it comes to the time from the preprint to journal publication, the median was 204 days. That ranged from 30 days to 600 days, so almost 2 years. And out of those 121, 108 had information on when the preprint was submitted, or another version which was submitted to the journal. And if we look at our sample of these 121, almost a third have been submitted more than 10 days before they posted the preprints. Around a third was also submitted around 9 days, so plus minus 9 days when the preprint was posted on the server. And then 40% were submitted more than 10 days after the preprint was posted. In other words, it means that it isn't always the case that a preprint will be submitted before it is submitted to a journal. Sometimes this happens afterwards, and you may be aware of, those of you who have maybe posted preprints on bioRxiv and medRxiv, that now they usually offer double services where you can automatically submit, when you submit to a journal, to a preprint server, or the other way around, as you're submitting to a preprint server, that you submit to a journal. Now, of these 121 studies, most were observational studies, and then the second biggest category was modeling. There were 4 systematic reviews, 3 of which had meta-analyses, and there were 6 other types of studies also among these epidemiology studies. I want to give here a little bit of a pause to see, is there any questions right so far on sort of things that we're doing, that I'm doing right now? No. So for the question, medical health journals, no. I don't know the exact number of medical health journals, but in Medline, there's around 5,000 journals indexed. Of those, probably around 4,000 are related to health sciences. The total number of health, I wouldn't really know. Probably from 5,000 to 10,000 in the world. When we're talking about 90,000, no, this is about all the journals that ever existed from all fields. No, I've looked at some of them because I also posted some comments on them on bioRxiv themselves, but I do not know that they have public reviews. Bear in mind, these are, since these went from 2016, some of the initiatives of ASA Bio and the public review did not exist. So I think it's unlikely, but we haven't checked.
So another question here is, what is the average time between posting preprint and publication in its final form? And who reviews the changes made to the preprints?
So I reviewed in this presentation that I'm going to give you. It is we who reviewed what changes happened. No one reviews them for all of them. That is something that I hope will happen in the future, and that we'll do it. But there's no. I would always say accept invitations to peer review if you can do them. What is preventing journals to public post the peer review reports? It really depends on the journal type. My journal uses open peer review reports, so we publish peer review reports. Nothing prevents you except your agreement with your authors and reviewers. If your reviewers and authors know that this is going to happen, they usually agree. Oh, even better. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas, could you give us a link to that source of information of 20 to 25,000 health journals currently? Submission data is related to the journal which published the paper. Yes. As there is no way to know if these preprints have been submitted to multiple journals before the one they have actually been published in, I don't know. It's likely that those that have been posted a few days before submission to a journal, that those likely weren't posted or submitted to any other journals, but for all others, we don't have that data. That metadata does not exist. Researchers are often unwilling to share how many times how many journals rejected their paper before finally one accepted it. Okay, thank you. So I'll go on for now. Now I want to stress out a few things. Even though we looked at what changes, there are some things that I cannot answer based on the data that we don't have. First is, was that change necessary or was it needed? What I do know is that it happened. Was it needed? It's something that I hope we will discuss here. Was it the best possible change and improvement? Again, it is very hard to agree on what would that be and who would make the best possible decision. Did it make the study better? That is a question, as I think most of you know, we don't have quality of study index or any grading that really is used out there. We often use either citation or like metric scores to sort of say how important the study was, but how good it was, it is not that we really rate like maybe Amazon reviews or something else, each paper to know how good was it actually done. Also, as we looked at changes between preprints and published papers, I cannot know would these changes happen because reviewers asked them, editors asked them, or the authors just thought, oh, this is something that could even more improve our studies. And we also don't know what would have happened in a parallel universe if these changes weren't done. So if the preprints were the only and the last version of that document, would the science benefited the same or would something else have happened? Well, these are extremely interesting questions. I think it will take different types of studies to answer them. So I'll share how we classify these changes, but also I want to a little bit share how preprints look themselves. As an author and an editor, I always want to know how does the paper look like when the authors actually write it down for the first time. So if you look at the titles, on average, there were 15 words in a title, both in a preprint and published journal version. The titles would range from 5 to around 25, 26 words. And 30%, almost up to 30% of manuscript title had some changes. Majority of them actually were small changes, like adding an S or D or A or an N. So most of them were only adding or removing one word, but 5 titles had changes with more than 3 words. Longest one being a 9-word change within the title. When it comes to how a title should be written, there are no strict guidelines across sciences, except that when it comes to biomedicine, many reporting guidelines say that in the title, we should list the type of study that we conducted. And of these 121 studies, 45% included study type in the title. And between the preprint to the published paper, only 2, the ones that didn't have this information, added it. So again, this is not a very strict rule across sciences, but this is something that possibly could be improved. When we look at the type of titles, as is known across all sciences, most titles that are indicative, saying something about the topic that they're covering. Only 10% had informative results, giving us the sort of main message of the paper. And then 5 were posed as sort of questions. When we looked at authorship, a median number of authors on these papers was 6. Only 8 papers had changes in authorship. Of those, 5 removed authors between the preprint and the published version, 2 added them, and 1 reordered the order, so the byline order of the authors. They switched places, number 3 and number 4 in this particular case, switched places in their names. 3 of these papers out of 121 also included a consortium name, so in the name of a group when a paper is published, and in a published version, one of these removed that consortium name from the authorship list. And 1 preprint did not have authors listed on bioRxiv, and then we contacted them and the authors, and this has been fixed since then. Another thing that sort of intrigued me was how many had shared authorship. We have seen across sciences the increase in number of shared authorship being the first shared or the last shared, and 13% had shared authorship in these papers. A surprising finding was as well that in 1 paper with 6 authors, all 6 were declared as being equal co-authors. When it comes to the abstract, the average number of words in abstracts was around 250, as we sort of expect. The abstract did range from 90 to 400 words. And on average increased by 2 words in the journal version. One preprint did not have an abstract, and one published paper did not have an abstract. These were different. So the preprint had it originally, but then did not have it in the published version. 16 of these preprints also had an author summary, and these, I think, were actually strongly related to the fact that they are required by the PLOS journals. Most of these preprints that ended up in PLOS journals were posted after they've been submitted to PLOS. So it's very likely that the authors have planned, knowing where they're submitting, to have the author summary question. Author summary is sort of plain language summaries, as they're often done. When we looked at the structure of the abstracts, 50% of the abstracts were structured in a sort of typical way of the IMRAD, or rather background methods results in the discussion. These subtitles or subsection names actually quite differed between papers. Some would have objectives, some would have the purpose, some would have conclusions, or more categories or less. But on average, 7 changed from unstructured formats to structured, and 9 changed from structured to unstructured formats. Section names also changed. To one example is here. So the paper that had background methods, results, and discussion, then in the published version had a purpose, material, and methods, results, and conclusions. Now, of course, we can sort of expect that these changes have because of the formatting or authorship guidelines expected by the journals, but it is often wondered how necessary those are. Now, how did the abstract content actually change? When we look at what changed in the abstracts, almost all of the abstracts changed. 90% of the abstracts changed, only 10% remained completely the same in the preprint and in the published version. For 25% of these, there were only copy editing, and by that I mean some spelling mistakes or some commas or that kind of edits done. One of those examples you can see here, where 20,000 was changed to include a comma in it. When we looked at the sections between an abstract, and these we sort of classified even for the unstructured abstracts based on the content that was in them, we can see here that most changes happen in the methods and results of the abstract, and only around 20% expand methods or add more details, and 70% add new results. All the other changes, in a way, could be sort of more cosmetic than of the content itself. And when it comes to the discussion, 16 of these 121 had new conclusions or new directions. Now, before I go into the details of the contents of the papers, as an editor, something that I'm very interested in is actually changes in the declaration section. And by those, I mean acknowledgements, authors' contributions, conflicts of interest, data sharing, ethics approval, funding declarations, and previous presentations. So when we look at acknowledgements in paper, 75% of preprints had acknowledgements in them. Most of them were called acknowledge or acknowledgements. Only a few were titled the disclosure or additional contributions. This information, however, instead of acknowledgements or disclosures, disclaimers, in 35% of cases contain information on funding and conflict of interest, which many other preprints would have a specific section, one being acknowledgements, the other one being funding, the third one being conflicts of interest. When it comes to the publications, we see here an increase because 83% of publications had acknowledgements. Some of them, 2 of these, just to state that there are none acknowledgements in them. So if we look at what changed within the text itself, 20 of these actually expanded them. Most of the others remained as they were in the preprints. When I looked at author contributions, and if those of you who are aware, author contributions can be either listed as ICMGA or most commonly as credit taxonomy contributions. And they were listed in 36% of preprints, but in 75% of journal publications, which means that, again, journals often require this, and authors don't maybe necessarily include them when they're writing their draft of the paper. Most of these in the publications were credit. Again, part of this could be because a large number of these papers have been published in PLOS journals, and they require credit for all of their publications. Of those that were in preprints, 16 actually changed, meaning that some of the contributions of the authors changed between the preprint version to the published version of the text. Here at the bottom, you can see sort of the common difference between how ICMGA for requirements for authorships are usually listed versus the 13 different steps in the credit taxonomy. When it comes to conflicts of interests, 40% of preprints versus 90% of journal publications had conflict of interest declarations. They didn't all call it the same. Most commonly, it is called either competing interest or conflict of interest. Sometimes it's statement of interest or potential interests. But overall, 112 of these studies mentioned either in a preprint or in a version of record that they have some kind of conflict of interest. Actually, they had a conflict of interest statement. Only 25% actually had conflict of interest as they were declared. And when we looked at what changed, only one preprint that stated that had no conflict of interest had it in the published version, and that example is listed here. So they very clearly stated there was no competing interest for any authors, and then there was a very big both funding and interest statement in the published paper. When it comes to data sharing, 22% of preprints had data sharing statements versus 64% of journal publications. Overall, 79 in a way mentioned data sharing. And most commonly for these papers, data was shared either within the supplement or the appendix, or was deposited in a GitHub or another repository, or was available on request. When it comes to changes in data sharing, again, only one sort of had a very direct change between data sharing statement. They said that in the preprint version that the data sharing was not applicable, and then in the published that all data sets are included in the supplementary files, meaning that journals potentially could have an important sort of role in making this happen if they wanted to. When it comes to ethics approval section was a separate section listed at 7% of preprints and was found in 16% of journal publications. Now I have to be very clear about this. We are not talking about ethics approvals being mentioned in the methods section. Most commonly today in biomedical papers, people mention ethics within the methods. Here I'm talking if they have a specific section like they do have for funding, conflict of interest, or author contributions within the paper. And finally, when it comes to funding, 69% of preprints had funding and 95% of journal publications had funding declarations. Even those that had funding declarations in the preprint, the funding in 30% of cases actually increased or changed. So there was additional information. One of those is listed here as well as an example. However, most of these studies actually did have funding, even though there were sometimes, like for a conflict of interest, when the journals would add funding information, no funding, most of these studies actually did have funding in themselves. And a final sort of declaration section that is very rare to see today in journals is where has this study been previously presented? Only one preprint had a specific section for this, and it is listed down here, and 3 listed this in the acknowledgement section. The one that had this as a specific sort of subsection was later removed in the publication version. So I'd like to take a little break here as well. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cough. To see now some more of your questions. No, when it comes to code statements, we only extracted information if they had it. We didn't compare it specifically for code. Something that we can look into. It is in our database and we will share it. So whoever wants to look at that specifically, that will be there. Thank you, Peter. This is something that I'll address a little bit in the end. Because I was very interested in how the preprints look like. That's why there's a lot of details, and that's why I'm taking these little breaks, because now you're going to see even much more of them. Because when we looked at these 20 studies that were published before, on average, they said not a lot of things change. And that really depends on what are we interested in. And it is exactly that at the end of this actual presentations that I'll ask you, the audience, another little poll to see which of these items do you think are actually important and you would want to know about. And I'll also share at the end sort of my vision of what are the important questions so far. But no, I'll come to the changes in figures and tables in a minute. As we said, there were 73 journals that these 120 papers were published. So we didn't look at all of their requirements because the sample sizes would be just, I mean, one requirement for each journal. We don't really see the benefit of doing that. We know that there is very likely that some of these changes, like the conflict of interest statements and declarations and authorships, that are really mandated by the journals. But we've known from many previous studies that even things that are listed in instructions to authors of journals are not always found in those journals themselves. So we actually published one of the studies, and it will come out very soon. It's been recently accepted, where we analyzed all of these changes that happen because of instructions to authors. And you will see in many cases that even journals that say that they have very strict rules on what should be listed in them often don't have them. And that even applies to randomized controlled trials and other things. So even when a journal says that something should be done, doesn't mean that it's done in that journal. So we decided not to look at that. We thought it's sort of too much work for, in the end, not a great benefit. We were more interested in sort of what changed between the two. Okay, thank you. So I'll go now with the actual content changes of the papers. So when we look, I'll again sort of split them into sections. First, the introduction part. Median number of words in introduction is 505 of these papers, but it ranges quite a lot. And on average, 30 words are added in the publication version. 88% of introductions changed. But we looked at specifically two things that we were most interested in. One is how many expanded their literature section, because introduction is mostly sort of previous research on the same topic. And then most introductions today, at least in health sciences, end up with clearly stating your objectives. 30% of these change their sentences about objectives. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've changed the outcomes based on any feedback. What I only know is that they changed. Did these objectives exist before, or did they exist after? Would require looking at protocols and other things. But what we do see is that 30% did change parts of their objectives. And you can see it here, one of those examples where they specifically or clearly specify what they have analyzed and what. And 20 of these only had typesetting changes, sort of mostly just a few words or, spelling from American to the English version or things like that. When it comes to the method section, methods are longer in these papers, on average 900 words, and those increased by 130 words in the published version. Again, a huge variety of ranges between different methods. 99% of these 121 changed, at least in a way, in their methods. 30% had additional analyses. 9 only had typesetting and copy editing, one of which had only copy editing, but now in their method section, they also included a data availability statement, but the methods themselves did not specifically change. And 7% of these had changes to sample size. One of them is presented here, where a study from 6,000 people went to 14,000 people, or from 9 to 14,000. And this was basically all, sorry, in this case, it was also based on what was the exclusion and inclusion criteria from the database that they had. It would be very interesting to know, with this kind of change, does it happen because reviewers asked it, editors, or someone else? That is beyond our, because we didn't have access to review reports, but it is interesting to see that these things can happen. When it comes to the results usually have a little bit less words than the method section. an average 804 words, and they increase around 80 words. Again, there's a wide range of how long the results section can be. 95% of these results sections also changed. 68%, which I think is intriguing, would add new results or remove some of the results. It doesn't mean, again, because we don't have access to the protocols or the peer review reports, I do not know if these analyses have been done before by the researchers and they just provided it when perhaps reviewers asked them, or they may be in the appendix and that they were moved here. But what we do know is that they did not exist before and then they were added. But only one of all of these had a different kind of statistical reporting that was required. In this case, it is the example that you see here, where on top of providing p-values for a regression model, they were asked to add odds ratios. And this happened twice in the results. But most of them, as you see, did have some new information provided there. When it comes to, and this is the question that we had when it comes to tables and figures, we can see that around 20 to 25% had changes in the numbers of tables and figures. Now, at this stage, we only looked at the changes in the number of these things, not specific changes that happened to the tables themselves or the figures themselves. That there's been a study who's looked into that. We decided for a while not to focus just on that, because as you see, there's a lot of data anywhere as this. On average, these studies would have 3 figures and around 2 papers, but that would range from 0 to 20 figures or tables. And then we come to discussion. Discussions are usually the longest part of these papers, and they increase by around 180 words between the published, between the preprint and the published version. 96% of discussion changed completely. 50% of them added some more limitations to them, and 10% changed the first sentence, the first outcome sentence of the results. One of those, as you can see here, in genome-wide association study, one had 70, then the published version had 69 results, and then based on different ranking, in the preprint they said 8, in the published version they had 12. So these are the kind of things that happen in the main results of the papers. And then 4% had absolutely no changes. Now this is bigger than the changes when we looked at methods and results sections. And then finally, papers end with references. On medium number of references on these studies with 36, they would increase by 6. Again, I do not know if these were asked by reviewers or by editors, or are they specific? This is analysis we can potentially do to see, are they specific for the journals? Do they want them to include publications from these journals or even from the reviewers, and sort of being even a form of questionable research practices? But we know that they changed. And when we looked at what is the type of references that most people use in biomedicine, it is often Vancouver, so it is the numbered one. But in the publication version, there's been an increase of changing those to the author date section, where they had none of them actually changed from one to the other. So overall, and there's many more that I haven't reported here because I do want to be on time. Many things can change in publications, but what changes do we really care about? Now, if you look at the results that I presented here, I think those that are really important are the 10% of those that have changed the main outcome sentence, that something happened there. 7% of those that change the sample size. It is often, some publishers today often stress it that as a reviewer, we shouldn't be asking this of authors. So it is really, I would always be interested in sort of why do we force them to increase the sample size? Either the results were not good enough or that they have data that could have done it. But in the end, did that sample size change the actual results is also what is a very intriguing sort of questions. Now, I wouldn't want to take not even these 10% and 7% numbers as something that you would generalize beyond these epidemiology papers, because if you see how many millions of papers we have published today in the world, I cannot claim that this kind of changes are specific for all of them. Much more studies are needed to do. And we also don't know which of these we really care about. To put it differently, if there wasn't peer review, how many would be allowed to be changed post-publication? So if, let's say, 7 and 10% would be the significant changes, would that be okay if they happen post-publication and that we don't waste then the resources on the 90% of other ones? Now, that is a very difficult question to answer, but I want you a little bit to think about it. And something that I'm working on and that I would pilot in my journal is, and what I wish to see actually across the world, would be that, like we have declaration sections for ethics review of conflict of interest, that every paper when it's published would include a peer review statement that would describe what happened during peer review. I think that would increase our transparency of knowing what has happened. It would also know what it is that we would also know what it is that authors miss, what it is that these experts, what kind of knowledge do they have that the authors didn't have, that didn't make these things happen. If introductions and discussions are mostly changed, but the methods and results are not, why do we care about that? Is it that the reviewers often have nothing else to say about, so that they feel they have to say something, so including a few more sentences is needed? Or is it because it's really hard today to keep up to date with the way the search engines work today? So it is very often that we won't be aware of other studies that have happened in the same topics. So it's good that the reviewers tell us about them. But how really is it needed that every study on the topic is included in these sections or introductions in methods?
So no, I'll go up. Are there examples where changes to a preprint were harmful?
If we could define harmful, I would love that. I think that there's been one survey that I often remember as being very significant when they asked authors, why did you make the changes based on the reviewers' requests? And around 25 to 50% said because they thought without them, the paper wouldn't be published, but they actually disagreed with them. So are they harmful? I don't know. I mean, what harmful to who? To patients or to our sort of mental health and frustrations? I think we all have experiences when you get some nasty comments in peer review and it affects your day. So it is harmful for that day. Is it harmful for the rest of the world? Probably not. So I think that I would love to do that kind of a study, but I think it's very hard to know what they've done. What we do today, what we usually estimate is when a paper that's been published has actually done harm. So we know about, vaccination and anti-vaccination studies and the link between autism and vaccination that has done a lot of harm. The paper that wasn't correct and was later retracted. So that's kind of harm that we can measure. For a paper that had changes, I don't know. One of the things that my PhD mentor often said is that every paper has a value beyond the value that it has for the scientific community, and that is the value for the author themselves, what they've learned both in writing the papers and in analyzing studies. So there's always knowledge that is gained, and that value can be good. When is that value wrong would be interesting. I think mostly we benefit from the discussion with other people in these, about our papers, but maybe sometimes they tell us that a wrong method of analyzing something, so maybe you wasted your time on another paper. I think that would be interesting to know, but case examples, again, on the larger scale of so many papers out there, it would be difficult to estimate how, overall would the benefit be bigger than the harms. Well, I'm sort of encouraged by this because this is the project that I will be working on in the next year of trying to classify these changes and developing a taxonomy similar to the credit taxonomy, where we agree on what are the significant changes that we want to know about. I often put the copy editing and the what I call cosmetic changes on the side, saying not that they're not important. I think my presentation could have even been better if I didn't have a cough and some of the slides were prettier. but in the end, the message is the same. And so we need to, we need to know, does it matter? One of the changes that I never talked about was, of course, the font or the capitalization of words or things like that. I think those are not what we're interested in. Yes, when it comes to artificial intelligence, I know that there's a few groups working on automatic detection of changes. But as those of you who know working in these fields, we would first need to have a corpus that is specified on what those significant changes are, that we can detect them. For example, it would be very easy to get immediately the number in word changes, but the word changes themselves don't tell us a lot. So sometimes we need to go into more details. I do think that the AIs are getting better and better and that will be able to tell us much more, but the similarity check itself is not enough. I think we need to know, we need to be able to flag when these changes are extremely important. What are your thoughts on peer review aiding in paper rejection? Well, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question. I've recently developed a peer review template that I want to have a structured template for my reviews where they would specifically tell me, does the paper require more literature introduction? Does it require changes to the objective? Does it require changes to the methods? Because often if you don't ask them directly to say yes or no to these questions, they won't answer it. But the first question in that template is there something in the paper that invalidates it, that it shouldn't be published? So yes, peer reviews do aid in paper rejection. I as an editor have rejected and sometimes reject paper without sending them to peer review when I find that another paper on the same topic has already been done better and nothing new information is added, or when I find a very, sort of beginners mistakes in some types of studies or things where things really need to be done. And instead of wasting the times of reviews, you tell the authors, you need to fix this if you want it to be sent somewhere else. So this peer review does aid in rejection of papers, it does. But always bear in mind, even preprints that were posted, and some of them, Retraction Watch keeps a record of how many of those have been retracted and never been published, is because sometimes we as authors will make mistakes and people will detect them. Some of those mistakes we can fix, but some we cannot. And sometimes, that's a rejection in itself as well. The community rejected your paper when you retracted it.
There's a comment from Peter Dodek, says, great presentation about an important topic, and I support your proposed statement about changes, but this is where limiting the items to those that are significant, as seen by a Delphi process or something like that.
I applied for 2 grant proposals with this idea, and hopefully get them, and we included actually a session of including experts and a Delphi study to analyze what are the significant things that we want to be included. Bear in mind, the ones that I mentioned here are quite specific for biomedical fields. When we talk about mathematics, sociology, humanities, other things would be, specific for them. So I don't want to even an exclusive list that everyone will need to follow. I think journals could have a variation of the statements of changes that happen based on what is important in that field. There are some things that we would want to know about.
Well, thank you very much. I kept the results of the poll up because we wanted to compare the last question asked, do we need peer review in its current form? If you recall, it was asked at the very beginning as well, and now at the end. And there was a bit of a shift. So the number of people answering yes went from 52 to 60%. The people of saying no went from 14 to 18%. But at the same time, the people who said, I don't know, I can't answer, went from 34 to 23%.
Well, I'm glad that we, that I sparked some interest in this. I think it would be great if we would have agreed on what are those important changes. But bear in mind, I'm not looking at these changes just for the transparency of what happened. I'm more interested in how can we as educators prevent them from needing to happen. why do reviewers need to change things in our papers? Is it because something we didn't know? And why don't we know that? Do we not have access to that with all the mass online courses, with the open textbooks that are being done, with the sharing information, what it is that we lack? And I think the more we know what are the most common things that are changed, then the education could go in that direction. We could try to prevent that, because in the end, I think that would be the goal. If the peer review, you know, it's so rare that it happens, but as a reviewer, you're also very happy when you get a paper that is almost perfect. And you're thinking, my God, this is so great, publish this. You didn't have to spend so much time on it. You didn't think that authors abused your time or that you abused them. So I think that that is where I would want to know. I'm very much interested in this, not only to increase the transparency of what peer review is, who is a peer reviewer, and did they did a good job. There's been only one study, as far as I know, where an official journal employed 2 different sets of reviewers for the same papers. And of course, they found that they asked different things. We know across peer review that the inter-rater agreement between reviewers is extremely low. And one of the reasons for this is, one, we don't ask them the same questions, so we can't even measure it properly. And second is, the experts differ in opinions, and they don't want to often, you know, clearly state something. But when we compare that, for example, I don't know how it's done in Canada, but maybe people have seen it how it was done in the United States, or for some grants, when you have 17 people voting publicly, should the Pfizer's vaccine be approved, not now when it was fully approved by the first time, and people having to say yes or no, you see that 15 of 17 experts said yes. When we look at the Supreme Court rulings, we know how many judges agreed upon some certain decisions. And yet we are still seem to be not doing the same for the papers that we publish. And this is what I would like to see happen, that we admit a bit more why we make some decisions and why do they need to happen. I know we're coming at the end of the time, so I don't want to keep you if you need to go. Thank you all again for joining. This is more people than I expected, so I really appreciate you sharing your day or afternoon or evening with us.